We continue now at the top of Daf Mem Amid Beis and Meseches Bava Metzia. This is Bava Metzia Daf 40b. On the previous summit, the Gemara said that Rav Yehuda bought a barrel of wine for 6 zuz, and the barrel of wine contained 48 pitchers of wine. He then sold it 6 pitchers at a time. Each set of 6 pitchers he sold for 1 zuz. We will note over here that when we translated on the previous summit, we said that he bought a barrel of oil. There are some that translate that way, but it is clear from Rashi that we're talking here about wine. In any case, the Gemara continues, if he's selling them 6 at a time for 1 zuz for every set of 6, so now dal tlasin v'shisa b'shisa, so now you should subtract 36 for the 6 zuz, meaning to say, he's now going to sell 36 pitchers of the wine for a total of 6 zuz. That equals the 6 zuz that he spent on the entire barrel. And pashule tresar, so now what remains is going to be 12 pitchers of wine that remains for him to sell or to keep. Dal tamanya shesuse, so then you should also subtract 8 pitchers, which is a total of 1/6, because that's what we said gets absorbed when it comes to the barrels of wine. And so therefore he doesn't have those 8 pitchers because they got absorbed in the barrel. So pashalu arba, so then he just has left 4 pitchers, and that's going to be his profit. And the Gemara says, Vamar Shmuel, but didn't Shmuel say, Hamistaker al Yistaker, Yoser al Shasus, that a person who's trying to make a profit, he shouldn't profit more than a 6th, but here he's profiting just 4 pitchers, that's much less than a 6th. And the Gemara says to that, Ika Gulfi Ushmarya, in addition to the 4 pitchers of wine as profit, he also has the barrel and the sediment, that also counts as profit. But the Gemara says to that, Ihachi, if so, Nafish le Tefemi Shasus, so then his profit is going to be more than a 6th. And the Gemara says to that, well, there is the bother, there is the effort that he had to take in order to divide out the wine to sell it, udmei bars niyasa, and then there's also the payment he has to pay to the person who's creating the tap on the barrel, and so then if you deduct that, it comes out to a profit of about a 6th. And Rashi explains, dal to losin v'shisa, you should subtract 36 pitchers, meaning kuze b'shisa zuze, that he's going to sell for 6 zuz, shekano pashu tresar, meaning that's going to be the amount that he spent, he's now selling that amount, he's breaking even, and he has left 12 pitchers of wine, and dal tamanya shesuse, then you should also subtract 8 pitchers, because that's 1/6, shel memches, meaning to say 1/6 of 48 is going to be 8 pitchers, shederechu lechaser b'vlias hakankan, which we said that's the amount that's going to be absorbed. Kedetanan, as we learned in the Mishnah, Yotzi lo shesus liyain, you have to subtract 1/6 for wine. Here you see it's clear Rashi understands the barrel has wine. Pashu lo l'scharo arba, so therefore you have left for the profit, there's going to be 4 pitchers. V'yamar Shmuel hamistaker b'dvarim sheyesh b'hem chayin nefesh. Shmuel said that if you're making a profit on something which again provides for a person life, so for those things, al yistaker yoser al shasus, you shouldn't profit more than a 6th. HaShasus yistaker, but you are allowed to profit 1/6. V'lama lo yistaker Rav Yehuda ad shasus, so why didn't Rav Yehuda, why didn't he profit until a 6th? And the Gemara answered to that, Ika gulfe ushmarya, there's also the barrel itself and the sediment, mistaker hu akankan v'ashmorim shalokach hakol bevav zuz, for 6 zuz he bought everything, that included the barrel, it included the sediment as well. And the Gemara said, Demei bars niyasa, the Gemara said, well, he did have to pay for the person who made the tap on the barrel. Shenosin damam lechanvani lemochron umotzion umachriz ola bechutzos. There's 2 explanations of this. One explanation is, it's actually the person who's announcing, who's helping him to sell it, he has to pay that person. Karz niyasa, lashon karza. According to that, the girsa should be karz niyasa, like the idea of making the announcements, making it public. Lashon acher, another explanation, more in line with barz niyasa, umnas yesh benekivas barza bechavis, shel cheres. It's considered to be a professional thing to put the hole in the barrel to create the tap, and that he had to pay for. And the Gemara continues at the 2 dots. The Mishnah said, Im hayashemen mezukak, if the oil is refined, eno yotzi lo shemarim, so then he does not deduct sediment. And then the Mishnah said that if it's in old containers that have already absorbed, so then you don't deduct for absorption. And the Gemara asks, Vahi efshar de lo bala, but it's impossible that it doesn't absorb something. And the Gemara answers, Amar Rav Nachman says, b'mizufafin shana, we're talking about barrels which are coated with pitch, and that's why they don't absorb anything. Abaye says, afilu tema shalo b'mizufafin, you can even say we're talking where it's not coated with pitch, but kavon de ton, once it already has absorbed, so it does not absorb anymore. And the Gemara continues at the 2 dots. The Mishnah said, Rabbi Yehuda says, Af ha-mocher shemen mezukak lechavero kol yemos hashana, even somebody who sells refined oil to his friend throughout the entire year, hareza mekavel olav lug umechza shemarim lameya, the buyer, he accepts upon himself that there's going to be a lug and a half of sediment for every 100 lug of oil that he buys. And the Gemara says, Amar Abaya says, Kishatim Tzalomar, when you analyze this teaching of Rabbi Yehuda, L'divrei Rabbi Yehuda, so according to Rabbi Yehuda, it's going to come out, Mutter la'arev shmarm, that in general, when you sell oil, let's say a mocher sells oil to a lokeach, he's allowed to mix in the sediment, and that's why he's able to deduct, and that's why the lokeach essentially accepts upon himself that deduction of the lugu mechza, of the lug and a half of shmarm, of sediment. And l'divrei chachamim, according to the opinion of the chachamim, aser la'arev shmarm, that it's aser for the seller to mix into the oil sediment, and that's why there is no such deduction. And the Gemara explains, l'divrei Rabbi Yehuda, according to Rabbi Yehuda, mutter la'arev shmarim, it's mutter for the seller to mix in sediment. V'hainu taima de mekabel, and that's the reason why the lokech accepts it. The Amar le, because the seller can say to the buyer, iboy la'ruve loch milo arvi loch, if I wanted to mix it in, couldn't I have mixed it in? So hashtanami kabel, so now also you have to accept it. I don't have to give you the full amount, I can give you a lug and a half of sediment. But the Gemara continues, V'lei molei, but why doesn't the buyer say back to the seller, Ioravdle, had you mixed it into the oil, have him isdavenly? So then I could have sold it as is. It would have been oil that's mixed with sediment, that's normal oil. But hashtamai avidle, now what am I going to do with this sediment? You're just giving me sediment with no oil, you didn't mix it into the oil. Lo misdavenly, it's impossible for me to sell it, and so therefore it's essentially a loss. And the Gemara says to that, the Gemara says, we're talking here not about a person who's intending on selling the oil. We're talking about a balabayas. We're talking about a regular private individual who's going to use the oil. So on the contrary, he'd rather have it that it was already refined. That's actually better for him. And therefore, again, he has to accept upon himself that lug and a half that's going to be sediment. But the Gemara continues, but why doesn't he say to him, meaning to say the buyer should say to the seller, midelo arvisli, from the fact that you didn't mix it in, achuli achaltali, doesn't that mean that you're being mochel, you're essentially forgiving it, and therefore I don't need to accept upon myself the sediment? And the Gemara says to that, Rabbi Yehuda l'taime, Rabbi Yehuda follows his opinion, de lesle mechila, he doesn't hold of this concept of assuming forgiveness. The Tanan, as we learned in a Mishnah, machar lo es hatzemed, if a person sells him the tzemed, that refers to the yoke for the animals, so lo machar lo es habakar doesn't mean that he's selling him the cattle. Machar lo es habakar, if he sold him the cattle, lo machar lo es hatzemed, it doesn't mean that he's selling him the tzemed, it doesn't mean that he's selling the yoke. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Rabbi Yehuda says, Hadam and Modin, you can actually tell by the amount of money that they're agreeing upon. Keitzad, how so? Amar Lov, he says to him, Mechorli tzimodcha, b'masayim zuz, he says, sell me your yoke for 200 zuz. So Hadavar Yadu Sheinat Semed b'masayim zuz. Everybody knows the yoke is not worth 200 zuz, so it's obvious he means to sell the cattle as well. But Chachamim Omer, and the Chachamim say, Ein Hadamim Raya, that the money is not a proof. And so therefore that machlokas, what is that machlokas about? The Chacham are essentially saying the amount of money is not a proof. There could have been mechila, there could have been forgiveness over here, but Rabbi Yehuda does not hold a mechila, and that's why over here as well, Rabbi Yehuda does not hold a mechila. And Rashi explains, Kishatim Salomar, Kishatidaktek Viteda Mitzvah Hadvar, meaning when you analyze this machlokas, it's going to come out of a machlokas, whether mutter la'arev shmarim or asr la'arev shmarim. And again, Abaya said that according to Rabbi Yehuda, it's mutter la'arev shmarim, it's mutter for the seller to mix in sediment. What that means specifically is as follows. Hamocher shemen l'chaveiro stam. Let's say a person sells oil to his friend, and he sells it stam, he doesn't make any specific conditions. Be'eshu mezuk, again, it's already been refined. Shashakov shaktu shmarav, meaning to say it's refined, that the sediment has already settled. So mutter lo la'arev u'levalvel shmarim hameshukos, he could just mix in all of that sediment, sheyachzeru v'yasarv, with it should all get mixed up again. V'yetzu mashemen v'so chamida, then when he pours it out, it's going to be oil that's essentially filled with sediment. That's okay according to Rabbi Yehuda, and that's why the lokeach has to accept upon himself that deduction of the sediment. But according to the Chachamim, Asr la'arev shmarim, it's Asr to mix in the sediment, shebechezkas mezukak lo chomimenu, because the presumption is he's buying it already refined, v'zem mekalkalo, by mixing it in, you're ruining it. V'hainu taimid the mekabel olav, and so again, according to Rabbi Yehuda, that's the reason that the lokeach is mekabel upon himself, logu mechsa shmarim, he's mekabel upon himself, the lug and a half of sediment, b'shalo erva, when he didn't mix it, v'nasan lo mezukak, and he gave him the refined oil. The Amar le mochri, boy laruve v'chulu, because the seller will say, if I wanted to, I could have mixed it in. Have him isdaven, and so then he argues back, but then I could have sold it. Kishayisi mocher bechanus. If I would have sold it in the store, nimkar shemarim imashem, and I could have sold the sediment that was mixed in together with the oil. And the Gemara answered to that, but balabayis haskin, and we're talking about a private individual, shalokeach balabayis, who meaning the buyer is a balabayis, v'lachol l'maychol beis, so he's just buying it in order to use it for himself, for his household. Tzemed is ha'ol, that refers to the yoke. Shu mutal al shnei hashvarim u'matzmidam. That's the yoke that essentially puts the two animals together, the two oxen together. They're attached through this yoke, and then they pull on whatever it is, whatever plow they're pulling, etc. on. Hadavar yadua, and so then there was a machlokas again, whether or not we assume that if a person sold the tzemed, he also sold the bakar. If he sold the bakar, did he also sell the tzemed? The Tanna Kama says that we don't make such an assumption, and Rabbi Yehuda says that we can go by the amount of money. Hadavar yadua she'ein tzemed nimkar b'masayim, says it's known that a yoke is not sold for 200 zuz. Obviously he's selling it together with the cattle, but the Chachamim say ein hadamim rai, the money's no proof. Even though clearly it's not worth that much. But the lokeach is mochel, that extra amount of money. They hold a mechila, and the point is Rabbi Yehuda lesle sheyem mochel min astam. Rabbi Yehuda doesn't assume mechila elim ken perish unless they explain that explicitly. And the Gemara continues and explains the position of the Chachamim, l'divrei Chachamim, according to the Chachamim, asur la'ariv shmarim. So then Abaye says that according to the Chachamim, it's asur to mix in sediment, v'hainu taima delo mekabel. That's why the buyer does not accept upon himself the deduction of the sediment, because he says to him, ibois la'aruve mihavishari lach. If you wanted to mix it in, would that have been permitted? It would not have been permitted. Again, according to the Chachamim, hashtanami lo mekabilna. So now also says the buyer, I'm not going to accept that deduction. And the Gemara continues, Amarle Rapapa li Abaya. Rapapa said now back to Abaya, Adrab on the contrary, Ibcha mistabra. Actually, the exact opposite is more logical. We should say as follows. L'divrei Chachamim, it's according to the Chachamim, mutter la'ariv shmarm, it's mutter for the seller to mix in sediment. V'hainu taima delo mekabel, and that's actually why the buyer does not accept the deduction of the sediment. D'yomar le, because he says to him, midelo arav t'li, from the fact that you didn't mix it in the first place, achule achlisli, it's clear that you actually were mochel. You must have said, you're being mochel that ability to mix in the sediment, and that's why I don't have to accept this deduction. However, Rapapa continues, L'divrei Rabbi Yehuda, according to Rabbi Yehuda, asur la'ariv shmarm, it's asur for the seller to mix in sediment, v'hainu taima de mekabel, and that's why the lokeach has to accept upon himself the deduction of the sediment. D'yomar le, because the seller says to the buyer, iboy la'aruve, if I wanted to mix in sediment, lo shari li la'aruve lach, it wouldn't have been permitted for me to mix it in, and so therefore, kibule lo mekabel, so therefore, if you don't accept the deduction, so zavin v'zavin tigra ikri is somebody who just buys and sells, is such a person called a merchant, meaning to say the seller is essentially saying to the buyer, I couldn't mix in the sediment, and if I don't deduct the sediment, then I'm actually not going to make any profit. Therefore, it has to be assumed that such a deduction is accepted by the buyer. As Rashi explains, Kibule namin lo mekabeles Allah chisarn hashmarm. If you don't accept the deduction of the sediment, imkein ma mistaker. If so, what's the profit? Harei haschar kulo b'shmarm. That's the entire profit. If you don't accept that deduction, there is no profit. Zavin v'zavin tagra ikri. You think if someone buys and sells, they're called a merchant bitmiya. The Gemara is asking this as like a question. Mashal hu leimor lashota lokach b'davin v'chazer u'machar below schar b'tikri tagra. Do you think a person is called a merchant just because he buys something and then sells with no profit? Of course, there is an assumed profit anytime a person is selling a product. And the Gemara continues, Tana was taught, Echad halokeach v'echad hamafkid, whether we're talking about a buyer or whether we're talking about a depositor, they have the same halacha when it comes lifikotim, when it comes to the residue or the scum that is floating on top of the oil. And the Gemara clarifies, my lifkotim, what does it mean that they have the same halacha in terms of the residue? Ilaim, if you're going to say, it means as follows, Kihechi de lokeach lo mekabel pikotim, just like the buyer does not accept upon himself a deduction of the residue, mafkid nami lo mekabel pikotim, so too the person who deposits, he also does not accept a reduction of the residue when it's returned to him. But the Gemara says to that, but let him say to him, meaning to say, let the person who's watching the oil, the shomer, he should say to the mafkid, what exactly am I going to do with this residue? Of course he's allowed to return the oil together with the residue to the original owner. So you have to say it's actually the reverse. Just like the depositor, when he receives his item back, his oil back, he has to accept the residue as well. So too when it comes to a buyer, he accepts a deduction of the residue. The Gemara says, but does the buyer really accept that deduction of the residue? But we learned in a brayser, Rabbi Yehuda says, Lo amru shemen achar ela lemocher bilvad. We only say that the oil, the murky oil, that has to be accepted by the seller and not by the buyer. Sharei lokeach mekabel olav lugu mechsa shemarim below pekatim, because the buyer is accepting upon himself a lug and a half of sediment without the residue. He's accepting that sediment, but he's not accepting the residue. And the Gemara says, Lokash, it's not difficult. It really depends on the situation. situation. In one case, we're talking where the buyer is giving the money in Tishrei. That's at a cheaper rate. And then he's taking the actual oil in Nisan according to the measurements of Tishrei. And so therefore, because he paid that lower rate, that's why he accepts upon himself the residue. But in the other case, we're talking where he actually pays in Nisan at the rate of Nisan. That's already when the oil was refined. And he's actually taking in Nisan according to the measurements of Nisan, according to the standard that it's refined in Nisan. And that's why in that case, the buyer does not accept the residue because he's paying that higher rate. And Rashi explains, it's the same halacha by a buyer and a depositor when it comes to the residue. It means they have the same law when it comes to the pekatim. And what are the pekatim? Rashi says, psolas hagarinim, it's like the seeds of the oil, hatzafin al pnei hashemen, that they float on top of the oil. Again, that's the residue or the scum. And Rashi continues, the Gemara eventually said, lokeach mekabel pekatim, that the buyer does have to accept the residue, meaning in machar lo shemen stam, meaning if the seller sells oil stam to the buyer, yikabel mimenu shemen im pekatim, the lokeach has to accept the oil together with the residue. And so then the Gemara asks from a brisa where it said lo amru shemen acher elo lamocher, that it's actually the seller that accepts the murky oil, meaning lo amru hefsed achiras hashemen elo lamocher, that loss goes to the seller and not to the buyer. And the reason the brisa gave is shaharei halokech mekabel olav lifchos mimei alugin lugu mechsa machmas shmarm, he's already deducting a lug and a half because of the sediment, the buyer's already accepting that. Lafikach tzarech litein lo shemen mezukak below pekatim, therefore the seller has to give completely refined oil without any residue. And so then the Gemara made a distinction. It depends how much exactly the buyer is paying. Kimida de Tishrei, if he's paying according to the measure of Tishrei, kishar hadamim shel Tishrei shu bezol, that's the cheaper rate in Tishrei. Ustam shemanim achurm, at that point in time the oil is generally murky. The kibalala pekatim, so he's accepting the residue. But hadashakal mine benisan kashar shel nisan, but if he's paying the Nisan rate, that's biyoker, that's more expensive. The derech kol hashmanim lios mezukaken benisan, because generally speaking it was in Nisan that they refined the oil. V'halokech stam v'hamocher stam ein mocher ela mezukak. There you assume anyone who's buying, anyone who's selling, the assumption is that it's refined oil. And the Gemara continues with the Mishnah, Hamafkid chaves etzel chaver, if somebody deposits a barrel by his friend, v'lo yichadu lo ba'ila makam, and the owner does not designate a specific place, v'tiltu lo v'nishtabra, then the shomer, he moves the barrel and it breaks, imitoch yado nishbara, so if it breaks from his hand, l'tzarcho chayiv, so if he moved it for himself, then the shomer is chayiv. L'tzarcha, but if he moved it for the benefit of the actual barrel, to protect the barrel, so then potter, in that case he's going to be potter. Now let's say it broke after he placed it down. It didn't break from him holding it in his hands. So then bein letzarcha, doesn't matter if he moved it for himself or if he moved it for the barrel itself. In those cases, in both of those cases, it's always going to be potter. He will always be exempt. Now that's all talking in a situation again where the owner does not designate a location. Yichadu lo habai l'makom, but if the owners do designate a location, v'tiltu lo v'nishbara, and he moves it and it breaks, bein mitoch yada, whether it breaks in his hands, uvein mishihinicho, or whether it breaks after he puts it down, letzarcho chayiv, letzarcha pater. So again, if he's moving it for himself, he's going to be chayiv. If he's moving it for its benefit, so then he's going to be pater. And Rashi explains, Lo yichadu lo habai l'makom, if there was no designated place by the owner, meaning bebeis shomer leimor lo zavis azu ashileni, meaning the owner didn't say to the shomer that I want a particular corner in your house, I want you to lend me that corner, that's where we're going to place it. And then there was a distinction made between letzarcho leheshtamish, but that means for himself he's going to use it, and letzarcha means for its sake. Shahais b'magam hatorfu krova leheshtabra, was in like an area where it would easily break. And then the Mishnah said in Mishahinicha, if he placed it down, meaning Shakila Tashmisha, the point is once he places it down, so he's no longer using it, Hoshiva b'makom mishtamer, and he put it down in a place that's well guarded. Bein shatilta la mitchila litzarcha, bein shatilta litzarcho pater. It doesn't matter why he moved it, whether he moved it for its sake or for his benefit, for his sake. In both cases, he's going to be exempt. Over Gemara parach ma'ishna lo yichdom yichdo. Now the Gemara will ask, what's the difference if there was a location designated from a case there was no location designated? That the Gemara will address. And the Gemara says, Hamani Rabbi Yishmael, who's the author of our Mishnah? It seems to be the opinion of Rabbi Yishmael, Da'amar lo ba'inan das ba'ilim, because Rabbi Yishmael says we don't need the knowledge of the owners. As the Gemara now explains, the Tanya, as we learned in a Brisa, Hagonev telemina edu, let's say somebody steals a sheep from its flock, Besela min hakis, he steals a coin from the purse, L'makom shaganav yachzer, from the place that he stole it, he should just return it. Divrei Rabbi Yishmael, that's the opinion of Rabbi Yishmael. Rabbi Akiva Omer, Rabbi Akiva says, and we'll take a look at Rashi. Rashi explains money Katani, who's the author of our Mishnah, meaning Hada Katani Reisha, meaning at the beginning of the Mishnah it says, that if after he places it down it breaks, and again that's talking about a situation where the owners did not designate a specific place in his house to put it, he moved it, so then it says that if it broke after he put it down, he's going to be exempt no matter why he moved it. Even if he took it for himself in the beginning, Pater, he's still exempt. Because what's the idea? The idea is that from the moment that he returned it, it's as if it's been returned into the reshus of the owners as it was originally. He's now just like a shomer chinam. Upater alone saying if an accident happens, he's pater. That's essentially what we're saying in that case where he places it down and then it breaks. Now, even though he never told the owners that I took it and I returned it, it doesn't matter. That's considered a good returning. Rabbi Yishmael, that seems to be the opinion of Rabbi Yishmael, that let's say a person just steals something, he can return it to its rightful place. He doesn't need to let the owner know, and we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Mem Aleph Amud Aleph.